Hello there, ladies, fish, and gentlemen. This is another installment in the farm. This is your host, Recluse, aka Steven Snyder. Rank Zero is on the astral plane engaging in the forces of darkness at the moment, but fortunately, I've got two terrific guests with me today. The first one has already become something of a staple, and I'd like to welcome back the great John Brisson once again of We've Read the Documents. John, thank you so much for joining us for this installment.
Anytime, Recluse. Thank you for having me back on the farm, brother.
All right. The next guest is a guy I'm really excited to have join us. This is his first time ever appearing on a podcast, though he certainly had some offers. I've been trying to get him on for a while, and even the great Jason Horsley of Autoculture gave it the old college try a little while ago, as I understand it. But we've got him on now, and I'm very excited. I've been working with this gentleman for a couple of years now. He's my research assistant and a brilliant one at that. He is one of the absolutely coolest people on the face of the earth, my friend Keith Allen Dennis. Keith, thank
Wow.
you so much for joining us, man.
Oh, wow. Well, okay. I guess I got a little bar to live up to here. Thank you, Mr. Recluse. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, I think you're going to do just fine, my friend. All right, folks. So today we've got an awesome show planned out. It's going to be based around a concept known as fourth generation warfare. But we're also going to tackle some council national policies, some Moonies, some toxic conspiracy culture, and maybe even a little bit of apocalypse LARPing. All right. So before we get going, Keith, why don't you familiarize the listeners with yourself and let them know a little bit about how you got to know me and how we became involved in some of these projects and what have you.
Okay. Well, thank you, and thanks for having me on. I'm just a dude that lives in the desert Southwest. I'm a songwriter. I don't really have any books or anything to like sell or hawk or a YouTube channel or anything like that. I'm just some dude. But I will say I'm just going to call myself your biggest fan. Have been reading your blog for about 7 years now. I got to do a great deal of writing and research on the World Anti-Communist League a few years ago, and your series on Wackel was like my study guide at the time for secondary literature. That and Dave Emery's excellent series on Wackel from about 1985 from his either Radio Free America or For the Record. I wasn't sure which one it was called by then. It's now called For the Record, but yeah. So those were like the study guides for the literature review, if you will, for my own research. And then I got some funding a few years ago to go to the Hoover Institution in Palo Alto, and I got to begin something I'll be doing the rest of my life probably, which is primary source archival research, like not the books, but the actual papers of the movers and shakers of some of these movements. And that's about the time I started reaching out to you. You calling me your research assistant. I'm honored to bear that title. But I'll go you one better and say I was also in a way your research leader, pushing you into like, hey man, you got to get your hands on some of this archive stuff. This is the juice. This is where you can tell stories and develop historical narratives that haven't been told before. And that's the difference between like a book report and a book, So, yeah, so that's kind of my background, and we've been collaborating, as you know, ever since, and just trying to get into this archive and that archive around the country, and developing a back catalog of useful material that you can say some new things with. So that's been pretty exciting, and it's exciting to have a buddy along for the ride on that. So yeah, that's the basics.
Yeah, absolutely. And we found some pretty crazy stuff for all you folks out there at home, including the glorious Sovereign Order of St. John Orgone Manifesto, which will be announced at some point on this show in the future. But yeah, your life will never be the same once you hear that.
Yeah.
All right, Keith. So, before we really get going, though, I know you're right there at the border with Mexico and Arizona. So, can you just tell us, have you seen the Chinese troops start to mass yet under the UN banner?
That'd be a no. I think I
Okay.
could get on I can get on my roof and see the wall from here, and it's all clear on the southern front.
All right, if
They're
you just, if
building
you
it
would
out,
just keep,
well, but I
if you
I
just
think
keep
I'm
us appraised,
pretty
man,
safe.
I want to make sure, in case the invasion starts, we can announce it on this thing while it's unfolding. But
Yeah,
in the meantime,
I need to
feel
know too.
safe here.
I need to keep me in the loop. Keep me in the loop.
Yeah, I'll be in the loop. I feel quite safe here. It's like the Hobbit said to the ant, the closer we are to danger, the further we are from harm. So
let us hope. All right, so okay, before we really dig into fourth generation warfare, or 4G warfare as we refer to it sometimes, Keith, can you tell us a little bit about the origins of this concept?
the I guess the first thing I would say about it is there's a lot of people out there that are a lot smarter than me on these subjects, and there's a pretty stiff difference of opinion out there as to whether the label 4GW really is necessary. I mean, you can look all the way back to some of the writings of Sun Tzu and the Art of War, like 1,500 years ago, and you can see it, elements of it. You can look at how Christianity spread and eventually took over the Roman Empire as an example of it. I mean, it's so the critics are like, well, if it's everything, then it's nothing. But as a modern concept, where it was kind of coined in the 80s by a guy named William Lind, who worked for this whole constellation of these new right think tanks. In this case, the Free Congress Foundation, the Committee for the Survival of Free Congress. That John probably knows all about this. It's right in there in that sweet spot with the Heritage Foundation and the CNP and all that. But he wrote an article in the Marine Corps Gazette in '89 announcing, this idea of it, and it's basically like, your first generation warfare would be your columns and infantry and cavalry and archers and and strict fire controls and hold your fire, move, that kind of thing. Then you get artillery and modern riflemen kind of making some of those concepts obsolete, and you get more of a reliance on indirect fire and like peppering the enemy with artillery and stuff like that. And then blitzkrieg and mechanized warfare, where you just bypass the front lines and hit them from behind with air and armor. That's kind of third generation warfare, and I'm really giving a very sketchy breakdown of this, but this guy basically said, fourth generation is like everything, all the above, if necessary, but the idea is it's non-state actors going up against a much more powerful force, where if you engage them directly on the field of battle, you're going to get smoked. So you got to kind of play it cool and clandestine, and it's a big emphasis on hearts and minds and cultural kind of warfare or political type warfare. It may spill into guerrilla warfare and low intensity conflict type of models, but it need not. You could say Martin Luther King was practicing it. The violence part of it is completely out of the equation on purpose, but it's a moral and intellectual fight, so he could, corrode and eventually overthrow the moral and intellectual foundations of Jim Crow without firing a shot. This is the same thing with Christianity. Their martyrdom, because of their nonviolence, becomes like a strength, because there's high PR value and and innocents being slaughtered, that kind of thing. But a part of it also is you make these diffuse kind of parallel hierarchies, kind of like a scaled up version of a lone wolf, where you got these cadres of actors that are all on the same team, working for the same objectives, but not answering to the same command structure. So you can't decapitate a headless beast, or like a hydra, you cut one head off and two grow behind it, kind of thing. So that's a big part of it. But there's some looks like what appears to be an unpublished manuscript by a guy named James Gamanaki on academia.edu. And I've been checking into that the last few weeks. And it kind of leads into why I got to be on this podcast in the first place. But yeah, that's that's where I kind of hit on this, and it looks from looking at some of the things that I've been studying over the years, and then now looking at through this concept, this model of fourth generation warfare, you can look and go, oh, I see how all of these different things play into where we are today, So that's the background, I guess.
No, it's definitely fascinating, and one of the things that kind of stands out to me is the overlap that it has to some extent with concepts that I outlined in my book, Strange Tales of the Parapolitical, such as Le Guerre Revolutionnaire and the strategy of tension. Keith, do you get a sense that these are, kind of concepts that were incorporated into 4G as well?
Well, your book's on order, by the way. Should be here any day now. Yeah, I suppose there's some similarities to be found there. That GR, revolutionary warfare thing you're talking about was more like a counterinsurgency strategy, of course, but the 4GW, as Lind conceived it, seemed to have been more like a modern, postmodern thing, specifically developed around the U.S., the military and their strategy and their domestic situation here. But you could look at the concept of like model villages, where you kind of got them sealed off to protect them from the insurgents and more importantly, their propaganda and their recruitment of your village into their network. And you get this information bubble around your model village where you're controlling the information that goes in and out. And when you've got the exits sealed, you can really control the narratives and, make people think the way you want them to think and believe the way you want them to believe. But but there's a good deal less emphasis on violence, as Lind was kind of talking about it. It's more like a hearts and minds kind of thing. But of course, that hearts and minds piece, I mean, that was the watchword through the middle of the beginning of the Iraq War, the sequel under GW, hearts and minds, that goes right to that 4GW concept.
Yeah. No, I mean, that is just, it's really just fascinating, especially in the whole concept of the model villages. I believe that was Algeria, where they really had tried to play those out the first time around. And
right, that becomes the model for the Vietnam version.
Kind of, it made me think a bit of the whole Phoenix thing too, and the kind of reappraisal of it for the hearts and minds and what have you. But so anyway, like, what were some of I know you mentioned a few of them briefly, but what were some of the other groups and movements and what have you that were pushing 4G in the late 80s and early 90s, Keith?
Well, like I said, a good, if counterintuitive example would be like Martin Luther King and Gandhi, right? But in the American context, and Lind was right in the thick of all this. You've got this network, this constellation of these parallel hierarchies of these new right think tanks and pressure groups that really got going in the 70s and really hit their stride in the 80s, the moral majority and the Reagan Revolution and and beyond. And I think the conspiracy theory entertainment industrial complex also plays into it. Maybe we can get into that later, because that's a subject that I'm very interested in as a conspiratard in recovery myself, so really anybody could do it. I mean, you could conceive of like Occupy Wall Street as practicing it in some ways. You can conceive of all kinds of different, like these critics of it say, is if it's everything, then it's nothing. So it's kind of a wishy-washy term, but going back to the Heritage Foundation and the moral majority, the Christian Reconstructionists, implied in Reconstruction, you can't reconstruct unless you first deconstruct. And that's a big part of the whole strategy, or the whole, mindset of it is you don't need to resort to guns and bombs and things if you can erode the confidence, the moral and intellectual foundations of your target, whether it's the French Empire or the liberal democratic, small L liberal democratic secular democracy that we have lived in our lives and grew up in. And I think some of those groups, it just seems like they really planned some of this out. And by 1995, like the middle of the decade, of the 90s, which is a crucial decade in all this, Lynn writes another article where he expands on the 4GW concept and basically says it's here, it's upon us. And the enemy is cultural Marxism, and these are the people that really push that meme. I mean, it's a household word now, but it wasn't so much in the 90s. But, these liberal professors, which Lind was quick to point out all happen to be Jewish, in many cases, they're undermining our morals in our society. They've got control of the news and media and propaganda. They've got controls of the university. They're flooding the country with immigrants. They're teaching cultural Marxism, and they're teaching women to show a little more ankle than we might like. And it has to be stopped, and we have to take the fight to the enemy, and therefore, we have to fight this new kind of war for this new kind of age in this new kind of way. But, and this is a thing that is, if you really look into it and you have eyes to see it and you train yourself, you can see it's like a projection. It's like a Twilight language thing where you go in the press and you say, this is what the enemy's doing and we got to fight back. But really, for those with ears to hear, you're actually communicating what your program is, but you're couching it in terms of this is what the enemy is doing. And I've seen that a lot in the last year and a half in just looking at all this right-wing propaganda rags. So some writers have interpreted, some of those warnings as, it's not a warning, it's a threat. And it's also a plan for action that's being disguised as an accusation against an enemy. So that's it kind of sounds like out on a limb, but I can back it up. I'll just say that.
Yeah, absolutely, with what's been going on. So, my understanding from looking at the article in Academia that you had just mentioned, the Council on National Policies played a big role in this, and also the Christian Reconstructionists and the Dominionists.
But you repeat yourself. Yeah. Anyway.
So John, you're kind of our leading authority here, and just generally one of the leading authorities all around on the Council on National Policy. Could you go in a little bit to them and the Christian Reconstructionists and Dominionists and what have you, and just kind of tell us a bit about the overlap between those groups and movements?
Yes, of course. First of all, I'm definitely glad that Keith has joined us in this conversation, Recluse, so we can definitely drill down to which is a big part of the secret or hidden right, as many people have called it. So the Council for National Policy briefly was an organization that was founded in 1981 by many prominent and powerful people, including the LaHaye's, Left Behind, Richard Vilgari, Paul Weyrich, T. Cullen Davis, the Hunts, Koch, John K. Singlaw, Robert Warren Stoddard, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Phyllis Schlafly. So yes, it was mainly majority of those people. Joseph Kors and the Kors family. Majority of those people were obviously right-leaning or conservative in quotation marks, part of the world order. And so the CNP was said to, around that time, to hope that they would gain influence, much as they believe liberals have through such organizations as the Council on Foreign Relations. And Woody Jenkins, who was one of the founding members of the CNP, once said to the press, I predict one day before the end of this century, the Council for National Policy will be so influential that no president, regardless of party or philosophy, will be able to ignore us or our concerns or shut us out of the highest levels of government. That's so true. The CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, everyone talks about them, or the Bilderberg Group. The CFR, you can go to their website, councilofonforeignrelations.com, and look at their membership list. Like, who is in their membership list. But with the CMP, you don't, except for what has been leaked or what researchers like all of us here have been able to uncover. And Morton Blackwell said at one time, the policy of the Council for National Policy is that we don't discuss who attends the meetings or what is said. Its memberships, meetings, and projects are all secret. Even though the group enjoys tax-exempt status, it focuses on foreign policy issues, which is somewhat true, but also focuses on domestic policy issues too as well. So many of the things that the CNP have been involved with, Iran-Contra affair, a lot of the Latin American and civil wars, like the El Salvadorian Civil War, for example, or supporting Augusto Pinochet's regime during the 1980s, and the drug trafficking that came out of Latin America, or the Franklin scandal, or INSLAW, and later on, eventually the funding of Al Qaeda through Al Taqwa Bank, or the impeachment, quote unquote, of Bill Clinton, or 9/11 and the war on terror. Now, granted, the CFR was also involved in some of these, to some degree, the left part of the world order, or what they call the globalists as well, like 9/11, the war on terror. You could say they were both involved in that. You could say the same thing with the drug trafficking from Latin America, because you have, the Mena, Arkansas, and the Clintons and everything. But yeah, the Council for National Policy is more of a hidden organization that represents the fascist right side of the world pyramid, in my opinion. And then from there, as far as Dominionism is concerned, now I'm a Christian. I do believe that the Council for National Policy co-opted modern-day Christianity within the United States and stored it more towards Dominionism, the New Apostolic Reformation, the acceptance of the Noahide laws, and Zionism. So you end up having, Dominion theology, or the different types. You have, Christian Reconstructionism, which originated with the teachings of Council for National Policy member R.J. Rushdoony. And then you also have Kingdom Now theology, is what you get out of like the late 1980s, which became the New Apostolic Reformation, and the co-option of Christianity as well. So a lot of that, a lot of that, this Christian Reconstructionism and Kingdom Now theology happened before the institution of the CNP in 1981. But the CNP definitely became a large part within the Council for National Policy. Now, Dominionism theology is kind of, in my opinion, a misrepresentation of Genesis 1:28. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and on every living thing that moveth upon the earth. So dominion theology, pretty much the way they use it as is, man is supposed to have dominion, complete dominion over the earth. And so the CNP wants to establish a Christian theocracy type government, or a synarchist type government, where pretty much the people are the feudal serfs, and they want to act like it's Christian, but anything is farther from that, in my opinion. The Family was a good series on Netflix, and also a good book too, by Jeff Shartet, that talks a lot about Doug Coe and the family and everything, and the prayer breakfasts, which also have ties in to Dominionism in the Council for National Policy as well. So yeah, I believe the Council for National Policy has been involved in numerous crimes of the world order since its inception in 1981, and influenced a lot of the Ronald Reagan administration. Reagan got some of his briefings on Iran-Contra directly from CNP meetings, which Oliver North was a long-term member of the CNP and got a lot of his funding from the Council for National Policy. As well as currently today, there are many members within Donald Trump's cabinet that either spoke at Council for National Policy meetings or were members of the CNP themselves. The CNP definitely has power. And just like the John Birch Society, which you can see connections to the John Birch Society being a prototype of the Council for National Policy in a lot of ways, many people within the truth movement are controlled by the CNP, whether they realize it or not. Alex Jones being a member, or these people having CNPers on their show all the time, like Joel Scalzo and Family, or Jerome Corsi. So yeah, a lot of the truth movement, did come out of John Birch Society and the Council for National Policy, and is steered to more of these right-wing parapolitical beliefs, but stored towards the globalists being the only boogeyman, or George Soros being the only boogeyman, or before him Maurice Strong. Insert globalist enemy here, while leaving the fascists to not be explored or researched, in my opinion. Did I do a good job explaining it?
Yes, absolutely. Keith, was there something that you wanted to add?
Oh, well, I guess I could, and it's the reason I'm glad to be in Mr. Brisson's company on this, because I've heard you, John, on Opperman's podcast, and I've maybe one or two other places, and it sounds like you had a bit of a journey to get to where you are in taking a closer look at the right side of the pyramid, as you put it. That in the conspiratainment industrial complex mainstream, which it is a mainstream, you almost never hear about this whole side of it. And I'm not down for a one world globalist totalitarian government. I'm not down with all that.
Me either.
I don't carry any water for the Democrats or any of them. I kind of look down my nose at the whole thing, but I don't want this other thing either, right? And so it's like, if you're some kind of researcher, if one wants to be a researcher and really try to find the truth with a capital T, why would you leave that stone unturned? Why don't you look at the left and the right hand? And the conspiratainment industry, really, the exposés are all skewed the one way, against kind of the Democrats, or what we used to call the left or whatever. So I appreciate you and your work doing that stuff. So I think it's great.
Thank you very much.
I like how you kind of tried to disassociate the Democrats from the left there too. That was very nice.
Yeah, that was 1968.
Yeah,
the right turn at Albuquerque, and it's like, yeah, okay. Anyway.
All right. So John, so what's your take then on this 4G concept that Keith has been telling us about here a little earlier on, and the fact that it was developed by groups like the CMP and movements like the Dominionists? Do you see this as being in keeping with the agenda that you've noted in this, what you kind of referred to as the hidden right?
Well, Recluse, when we're looking at the right's agenda and their involvement in the world order and involved in fourth generational warfare, which the left does it too, as Keith had mentioned earlier, but definitely within the conspiracy culture, the right is very much pushing it and driving it. So, for example, I guess one of the most modern representations I can give is you guys are both well aware of Cambridge Analytica and their influence on the 2016
election,
right? Which Neil Sanders has done excellent work on that. Very good work on exposing that. But I mean, that would probably be my biggest, most recent representation of that. I mean, we'll talk. Later we'll probably discuss the coronavirus protest too as well, being an example of that, at least on the right is concerned. But yeah, Cambridge Analytica, farming information on the internet through Facebook. Of course, it was started by the Mercers, the Zionist Mercers, who were CMP members who helped fund Donald Trump's campaign, and Council for National Policy member Stephen K. Bannon. So Cambridge Analytica harvests information from Facebook, and using that put forth targeted ads and targeted Facebook groups to people to get them more polarized to the right, to lead them into voting for Donald Trump, and in some degree radicalizing them with what eventually would become the alt-right movement. Through articles that could be considered, not to use their own language, I guess, fake news, to incite anger and feeling not based off of logic, and end up being irrational. So that would, in my opinion, and I hopefully you guys would agree with me, that would be a form of modern fourth generational warfare to influence society's opinion, being the United States, into voting for Donald John Trump during the election, and it worked very well because it worked on me, who beforehand I was always said left, right, it didn't matter. I wasn't a part of the believe in the left, right paradigm or trapped in it, so I thought. But when I saw Alex Jones, who I hadn't listened to in years, but he started pushing Trump, and they all started pushing Trump together, and even Jeff Rent started pushing Trump, who I'd listened to. And I was like, man, maybe Trump's really our guy, right? I mean, maybe it's possibly saying kind of sort of the right things as candidate Trump, that the United States is guilty of its own fair share of crimes, and he wants to lock up Hillary Clinton. And but I didn't know about Trump's numerous connections to the Russian oligarchs, or him being connected to Epstein, if not more than the Clintons. So all that was hidden from me by this right wing media establishment, even that's controlled in the alternative media or the conspiracy culture. I had no idea.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until a friend of mine showed me Josh Reeves' Secret Right during the election, and I kind of just blew it off. I was like, man, I would have heard about the CMP already. Alex Jones would have told me about that, not knowing that Alex Jones was a CMP member, and pushes their agenda. And then later, when Trump started filling up his cabinet members, I started recognizing that a lot of those names were people that I saw in that video, going back and remember it. So I went to watch it again, and I remember being in my kitchen and me just going, no, 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 no. Like, how could I be wrong about this, And then realizing, oh my God, the Council for National Policy is real. This whole right wing, part of the world order is real, and they have control of the alternative media, and I've been fooled, and I realized that. So a lot of that, in my opinion, is this fourth generational, type warfare on people, kind of like an information warfare, like InfoWars that Alex Jones
There's a
got
war
from,
for your mind. He says it right there.
yep, and Alex Jones
Yeah.
got from Michael Aquino and CMP member Paul Vallely's from PSYOP to Mind War paper. So this is very interesting that Alex Jones chooses to take that term for InfoWars, chooses to take Prison Planet from Scientology, and so yeah, it's like, well, does Alex Jones know where these terms are coming from, or is he using these terms on purpose? Now my belief now is he's using these terms on purpose. But it's just I think all of that is fourth generational warfare, in my opinion, at least from the right side of the world order in these modern times.
Now, an interesting thing too about Cambridge Analytica, it had its origins actually in a British company called the SCL Group, which was short for Strategic Communications Laboratories, and then before that it had been known as Behavioral Dynamics Institute. So, yeah, they're kind of laying out, right there with some of these older titles what these guys were about, and just in terms of just the establishment connections. I mean, one of the early directors was reportedly Lord Ivor Mountbatten, who's a part of just the degenerate Mountbatten family, of course. Lord Mountbatten, Uncle Dickie, was Prince Philip's uncle, so there is the ties into the royal family, and of course, just Lord Mountbatten was just implicated in a host of pedophile scandals, including the Kincora Boys' Home scandal, the Milford Haven branch of the family turns up heavily in Perfumo, and a lot of other just bizarre elite sex rings. Other members were people like Jonathan Maynard, who was a treasurer of the Tory party in the UK, and historically that was a position especially that had a lot of dealings in the illicit arms trafficking that the British are so knee deep in, beginning during the Thatcher years. The great Geoffrey Gilson really went into that a lot in Maggie's Hammer. But just to kind of as a note there too, you can kind of see on the flip side of the coin, you also had this kind of counterpart in the British establishment as well. And this really went high up. I mean, really into the royal family itself, which I also kind of think really illustrates just how disingenuous the outsider status of some of these CMP aligned individuals like Steve Bannon have tried to take on with all of this. But anyway, let's get us back to the matter at hand. Keith, now I know you've done a lot of research into the Unification Church, sometimes simply referred to as the Moonies on account of the founder's son Mayan Moon. It's a fascinating topic, and at some point I'm hoping to do a full show with you on the Moonies soon. But let's cover so we can cover that particular cult. But for now, let's get into the possible uses of 4G by the Moonies in brief, if you could.
Well, if you go to Lynn's articles, which by the way, his website is still up. I think it's called Global Gorillas. Yeah, the last updated in 2009. But all these articles you can read it in his own writing, right? But kind of one of the legs on the stool of this asymmetric, type of warfare is you use the enemy's strengths and turn them into weaknesses. So if you have like a free, open, pluralistic society that has no prohibitions on religion or freedom of conscience and freedom of speech and things like that, you can go in and use those freedoms afforded by that society as kind of cover to undermine that society, even while benefiting from those freedoms that allow you to do just that. And that seems to have been the MO from the beginning with them. They really start. I mean, one of the things that it's kind of off the subject, but kind of isn't. In John Gorenfeld's book Bad Moon Rising, I think it's from 2006, he talked about when Bo-He Pak, Moon's lieutenant, KCIA officer, as soon as he gets off the plane, when he first comes to the U.S. as kind of like the John the Baptist of the Moon, he starts meeting with the ICS, International. It's a precursor organization to the family. One of his first meetings. It's like late 50s, maybe 60. So anyway, that's an aside. But they really got going in the U.S. in the 70s, and he built a very large mass movement, hundreds of thousands of people in Japan by that point, and was really trying to take over the World Anti-Communist League. And he had this, the Wackel's biggest conference ever was Tokyo 1970, and it's because of this mass movement that he built over there. And he hoped to be able to do the same thing in the U.S., but found us Americans to be soft and weak and not down for like totalitarian mass politics that apparently our Japanese counterparts were down for, right? So he went kind of another way. So his International Federation for Victory Over Communism, its analog in the U.S. was called the Freedom Leadership Foundation. And it got started in 1970, right when that big Wackel conference was happening, right when they're getting ready to kick Taiwan out of the UN, right when in the United States, the American Council for World Freedom gets started, and it was conceived of as this is going to be the letterhead organization that's going to be the American Wackel chapter, which it became over the protest of some of its members who saw the Moon involvement in Wackel by that point and saw it for what it was and said, we don't want any part of this, but they eventually went along with the program. But anyway, I got my hands on a Freedom Leadership Foundation pamphlet from like 70 or 72 maybe in some archival research that I did like 2 years ago. And it's like a little recipe, like a top level elevator speech on building cadres, building cells. Jesus and his little handful of 12 disciples changed the world, and you can too. Get your little group together and find a cause that you feel like you can be effective in, and come to our seminar and take our classes, and we'll tell you how to do it. And I think, I'm speculating, but I think some of the techniques that are laid out in that campaign or in that brochure, it just kind of hints at it. But I think some of the heritage guys and the CNP guys and the Dominionist guys and the Moon people were all kind of drinking from the same well as far as best practices and techniques that have been developed over time to make political changes in a kind of out there in the open, legal, but also kind of semi-clandestine way. It's kind of in the shadows, but it's also like right there. But yeah, I mean, when he went to prison, Moon went to prison for like 18 months in the mid 80s. He shared a cell with James Baker, the guy that sells the prepper food buckets. No kidding. But, he had the ACLU come into his defense. He had people saying, in the press, like, are the Moonies the new Negroes, like they're this persecuted underclass. And So you had like elements of American society, like the ACLU, that defend freedom and defend, people's First Amendment rights no matter what. This is an American institution coming to the defense of a man and a movement that ultimately meant them great harm. And so it's this asymmetric, it's like a judo rather than karate kind of thing, we just use the enemy's strengths to our advantage. So, yeah. And then the other one is the parallel hierarchy thing, where, you've got this constellation of groups and cells and little activist bases, you can look up on Google like Mooney front groups. There's a web page out there, and it just goes into the hundreds of just all these different letter alphabet soup of different, International Federation for Kittens and Rainbows or whatever. You could wind up working for one of these and be on the same page as the Mooney Empire and not even know it. And this happened with people a lot of times. They're like, I didn't know that it was a unification church thing before I joined, and I left when I found out. And Moon was like the master of that. But the last thing I'll say about it is about the Mooney thing is you would think that the conspiratainment complex would be all over that story. It checks all the boxes. You got the drug stuff, you got the Reagan's, kind of shadow foreign policy happening. You got the cottage industry of cult deprogrammers kind of grew up in the 70s. It wasn't just because of Moon. There was a lot of other cults that were ravaging American youth and disillusioned hippies in those days. But the Moonies it was a big part of why you get these cult deprogrammers in the first place. You got Poppy all up in it. You got Moon advocating for a one world government and one world religion with himself as the second coming of Jesus. You got out of his mouth this open, full-throated contempt for the United States and its system of government. And behold the pale horse off your shelf and find me anything about the Moonies in there. Go back through the InfoWars archives and find me some Mooney stuff in there. It almost just doesn't exist. Go look in the big conspiracy podcasts that are out there that'll talk flat Earth and 5G towers are giving us Tecate virus or whatever. This all day long. What does Kanye think about the Illuminati this week? The Moon is always eclipsed. They don't ever touch that stuff. Just like with the CMP. And my theory on this, my meta conspiracy theory, is that the conspiracy theory industry is itself an arm and a species of an appendage of conservative politics. That's why the Moon's eclipsed. That's why
it is.
And okay, so on that note, let's get into briefly. I need to let the readers know one of the big coups that Sun Mayan Moon had in the 80s in terms of shaping narratives and so on and so forth was taking over the Washington Times.
No, he started it.
Oh yeah, that's right. He started it.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
So it's okay. Yeah, I couldn't remember if he started or founded it, but thank you for took it over or founded it. But thank you for clearing that up. Okay, so he founded the Washington Times. Okay, that became a major mouthpiece of the emerging conservative, neoconservative movement, whatever you want to call it, New Right under Ronald Reagan. Now, the Washington Times also kind of became quite noteworthy to many conspiracy theorists for revealing the Craig J. Spence cowboy ring in the late 1980s, which of course was eventually linked into the Franklin scandal and all that good stuff. So a lot of that, kind of research really had its foundation in these, series of articles that the Times published, and I think it was 1989 if I remember correctly. Keith, do you see this as potentially being a part of 4G warfare?
God, you want me to talk about the Franklin scandal on the internet? Okay. We're in the deep end of the pool. Well, just back up and look at the Washington Times and look at the 4GW idea. It's like you need to get control of these leverage points over society, and one of those is education. And, you look at your New Apostolic Reformation, and there's 7 mountains, like these are the pillars of society that we need to kind of get control of. And the media is one of them. And so Washington Times was supposed to be like the answer to this liberal media that just wasn't towing the line on gunning down buses full of nuns in Guatemala or whatever. They just couldn't quit crying about it. So we need our own press organs to press the organs. So that's kind of the impetus behind the Times, the Washington Times, and then later Fox News is, but anyway, I'm not going to talk about the Franklin scandal. Y'all probably know more about it. I've just like, I don't have time to look into some of that stuff. When you look into these real dark corners of the conspiracy world, and even if it's true, whether it's true or not, it's like you kind of self-traumatizing, you just like, you need a shower afterwards. You know what I mean? Like, I have, my garden is planted, it's hot, so the swamp cooler's going. If I really, like, on purpose, let me read this John DeCamp's book on this, On Purpose, right now. The amount of showers I'm gonna have to, my water bill's going to go into the unmanageable very quickly. But what I'll say about it is, if you look at how close, besties might be too strong of a word, but Poppy Bush and Moon, they were thick as thieves as far as advancing the same agendas, as far as their mutual connections to, like, the Heritage Foundation and the Moral Majority, and Moon writing checks, bailing out these TV preachers one by one when their lifestyles got ahead of them. It's all happening during the same time Bush, his reign, in the Reagan years. So, and that continued. The Moon people supported his son when he was president, big time, political, monetary, media. So anyway, the point is, all of that stuff, okay, you can make a coherent picture out of it, and then you throw this monkey wrench into it. It's the Mooney Times that breaks the Franklin story. And maybe somebody out there knows what is behind that, but for me, it was always like, wait a minute, why would it be this paper doing that? Was he still pissed about being put in jail? Was he calling Poppy's bluff on something, saying, you want to play, Poppy? Let's play, and put this on the front page. That kind of a story. I just, Moon was not exactly a hands-off kind of guy. So you can imagine, like, the editors are sitting on this story going, do we publish this, or we don't need to ask the boss? No, I don't think so, man. So that's a real mystery. Why did the Washington Times, the Mooney Times, break the Franklin scandal? I don't know the answer, but it's the thing that sticks out in my mind the most about that whole dark story.
Yeah, it is certainly a great curiosity. John, could you weigh in on this a little bit? Maybe give us an idea if the CMP was also plugged into the Washington Times and the limited hangouts, and with Sun Maya and Moon as well, and possibly if you've got an interpretation of these events?
Yes, I can. A couple of things. One, both George from cavdev.org and I, Keith, have questioned whether or not why the Mooney Washington Times became involved in the reporting of the Craig J. Spence callboy scandal and the Franklin scandal, which we really didn't know at the time that the Craig J. Spence scandal directly connected to Franklin until Henry Vincent's book came out almost a decade or two later, Confessions of a DC Madam. So it's very interesting that it was Paul M. Rodriguez who did a bulk of that reporting on those type of right-wing scandals. Now, I tend to look at Paul M. Rodriguez as being an honest investigative journalist because he was later, from this honest reporting that he did, and he did some of the best reporting of the Finders, the Callboy scandal, and of Franklin that was done. He was pushed more into this magazine that the Washington Times had owned, and later his career was kind of like pushed towards, not being of anything of importance. Like, you have to go write for this. And so he ended up, not really winning any, prizes or awards or anything for the high quality journalism that he broke. Instead, he was kind of pushed aside and was given to other people. who I believe were to co-opt these other writers for the Washington Times, that were to co-opt these narratives that Paul had written and to change them and to bend them into the will of Moon and the Council for National Policy. Okay. So that's how George and I kind of look at it. I'm subject to change. If you come up with any evidence to the contrary, do let me know. We do have evidence that John DeCamp was not who he represented himself to be. George and I have talked about it on my channel extensively. We've read the documents of how DeCamp is very questionable, similar to Ted Gunderson. That there's supposed allegations of DeCamp taking pictures of his underage teenage daughter when she was getting out of the pool naked, which he claimed it was like bath time photos when she was younger, which was not the case. And DeCamp being a womanizer and making inappropriate bakibazi jokes about Afghanistan boys to one of the people that he had met with. I almost think DeCamp was there to co-op and not get the full truth out about the Franklin scandal.
You guys must be a lot of fun at parties, right?
Yeah.
The shower awaits. Anyway, sorry.
So
it's dark stuff, man.
Oh yeah, it is. I mean, I'm one of the foremost research into the finders, and it's difficult. It's not. I'm not going to say that it's easy to research these type of things, but I mean, it's got to be done one way or another. So I mean, as far as the Mooney Washington Times covering up these events, I think Paul and Rodriguez did good work, but I think they kind of co-opted it later by putting, and then of course you have Arnard D. Borchgrove, who was a Council for National Policy member, who was the editor, advising editor for these columns that were written, and of course he's crooked as they come. So if he's supervising it, then imagine what was cut out of these articles, and what was underreported. So yeah, I mean, as far as that is concerned, I do think it was controlled reporting, but I do think Paul and Rodriguez was honest, unless I'm shown evidence to the contrary. But as far as the CNP being involved with the Moonies, I mean, yes, there was numerous Council for National Policy members who had relations to the Unification Church and the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. I mean, Tim LaHaye, for example, who wrote the Left Behind series and was a founding member of the Council for National Policy, and a big reason why we have messed up theology when it comes to the Book of Revelation, Protestants do to this day. He received $500,000 from Bohai Pak, the gentleman you had mentioned earlier, was a former Korean CIA officer, and kind of like the John the Baptist for Moon, who I believe was a blasphemer, and that Moon said that Jesus had failed his mission because he was quote unquote executed, and that he was the new Messiah.
And the moral majority says you're hired.
Yeah, and they all love like all these supposed Christians, and then of course later that congressional meeting, which I know Keith, that was done, where you had both the Democrats and the Republicans, in Congress, crowning the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, and it's like, well, what is this, and you're right. Why doesn't anybody? I've never heard about the Moonies when I listen to Alex Jones. Why aren't any of these so-called truth tellers? You think they would jump all over, especially
checking all the boxes, man. Checking all the boxes.
Yeah. Especially the ones who call themselves Christians, like Alex Jones. You think he would be all up on this? He'd be like, man, there's this guy named the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, and he thought he was Jesus, and he was a blasphemer, and he was connected and funding, Tim LaHaye, and funding the Council for National Policy, and funding the Iran-Contra affair, and you think he'd be all up on that, right? And and buying Jerry Falwell's $73 million debt for Liberty University.
Yeah, bailing him out. Yeah.
Yeah, but no, instead they're like, who? Moon who?
Forget about him.
Unification Church. What? So, it's just a problem. It's a major problem.
It's almost like it was really just about power all along, and not scriptural adherence and being faithful to your doctrine of your own holy book, you know?
Yes, of course.
You know, if you let this guy, if you take money from him, what is that? I'm sorry. It's just it boggles my mind. And people say now, that the religious right have kind of sold their souls in the age that we're in currently. And I look at the moon thing and I'm like, no, that was in the 70s. That ship sailed. I'm serious. It sailed a long time ago, just trading it for things of this world, Yeah.
Actually, or it even happened before then, Keith. If you look into the family, and Douglas Coe, I mean, and the power of positive thinking, and Trump's Norman Vincent Peale, his mentor pastor. It's been going on for a long time.
I read Norman Vincent Peale was actually an Axis spy, but I haven't been able to run it down for conclusively.
If that's true, that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you've got the whole moral rearmament movement lurking back and all this, too. Of course, Miles Copeland, the infamous CIA officer and the father of the drummer for the Police, Stuart Copeland, wrote a rather fascinating book where he essentially acknowledged that the moral rearmament movement was part of the high occult forces the CIA was using, in contrast to something like the Church of Scientology is the low ones.
Yeah, occultism in high places.
Occultism in high places, yes, yes.
Let's get Gene Dixon another meeting with Nancy and Ron, Well, the signs tell me.
Gotta do some channeling in the office. I mean, come on, let's be real here.
Probably they were trying to communicate with plants if Baxter was involved in all of it too. But we'll tell you guys about that at some other point. But okay, so let's get into the period right after the Cold War. I mean, this seems like it was a really significant period around 91, 92, 93 in terms of, what you could almost characterize as twilight language and how, it was being used to trigger the radical right and so on and so forth. Keith, do you see this as possibly being a part of 4G warfare being rolled out in force at this point in time?
Yeah, I do. And I, we've talked about how Bush and the Moonies and the fundies, the moral majority and this whole constellation. I know it doesn't have the production values and it's not as sexy as some of the things you'd see in the mainstream, right? But yeah, they rolled out this whole program and so they were all kind of tight with each other, if not on a personal level, but just in terms of we're all working for the same goals, right? So to have G.W. Bush, who was a total ally of all those forces, stand up and give his New World Order speech, it's another one of those things that just doesn't fit the narrative. So what is it? Was he trolling? I mean, and then within a year, his ally Pat Robertson has a book out called New World Order, and you can predict, it's just kind of framing it in this end times, or take this New World Order trope of a one world government and totalitarian whatever, and we graft it onto the Book of Revelations and take massive liberties with the scripture that we're supposedly all about and root it firmly in this world and in the realm of politics. So the 90s was when Alex Jones was coming up. That's when Bill Cooper was getting, coming up. John Hagee wrote, was it Day of Deception? It's basically, and of course, Left Behind series, Kirk Cameron, and what is it? It's a one world dictatorship government. And it's also the Book of Revelations and the Antichrist and all this stuff. And so, anyway, a central pillar of the 4GW thing is that on the moral and intellectual level, you undermine people's faith in the legitimacy of the government you're trying to get control of. And that's been, this New World Order thing has been this hammer, that's been used ever since. And this NWO trope, I'm not saying the dog won't hunt, okay? And we can talk about that because there's some truth to it, but yeah, you just kind of get this coordinated propaganda blitz where it takes this turn, in the Cold War. It's rampaging, godless, atheistic, communist hordes of various colors, none of them white, and they're going to come, take over the free world, and they're coming for our white women or whatever, And then in the post-Cold War era, you get this domestic propaganda thing. It had always been there, but it was more like an old right, kooky John Birch thing. But now it kind of comes into this mainstream penetration into people's consciousness, and the godless, atheistic, communist hordes are now replaced with literal supernatural evil, the devil himself here on earth. And this was all foretold in the prophecy, in the book of Revelation, and all this kind of stuff. And it really represents a new phase. And of course, they got a Democrat in the office, so they can just wail at him. And part of the strategy there is the opposition can never be seen as legitimate. Even if they do something right, you gotta still hammer them, and you gotta hammer, let's roll out the Vince Foster tapes again or whatever. You gotta just be relentless about it. And that went for the Republicans as well. And George H.W. Bush really played into that by announcing the New World Order. And this guy knows all these people. He knows who's hearing this message and how they're interpreting it. If you come out there as president and say, we need a New World Order, the guy was not stupid. You can't sit there and go, well, everybody's going to be cool with this. Ministry's going to make a great song out of it, and that'll be that. No, it's like trolling the right wing and activating them. You know what I mean? And Poppy, I think, wanted a lot of the stuff that has happened. And I think maybe, I'm just speculating, okay, but I think he was willing to be the boogeyman, the fall guy. He's like, yeah, I'll get up there and say New World Order if it gets people to lock and load and overthrow this, this whole regime. And I may be way too out on a limb on that, but I'll give you an analogy, something that Bill Clinton had done earlier. And I don't remember if it was when he was getting the nomination or if it was a commencement speech at Georgetown or something, but he gives this full-throated endorsement of Carroll Quigley, the biographer of the Yankee, the original NWO guys, the Yankee
Tragedy and Hope, and the
Anglo-American establishment. Yeah, he was their biographer, and he had his book suppressed, even though he was down for all of it. He was like, I agree with what they're doing. I don't understand why they got my book pulled off the shelves. But, the right pilfered or plagiarized Quigley's work. And I want to say it became, none dare call it conspiracy, and I'm probably wrong. Somebody out there knows. But they really cribbed a lot of Quigley's stuff, and they spun it in their own way, and turned it into their own propaganda. But anyway, the point is, the old right knows very well who Carroll Quigley was. And if I was Clinton's speechwriter, I would be like, we're taking the Quigley stuff out of here, dude. You're not getting up there licking that boot in front of all these people. It's going to drive the Birchers crazy, and it did, So I wonder if there's some kayfabe that goes on with some of these messages. But whether that's true or not, this kind of became like this new phase, and it's the New World Order, and it's the book of Revelations, and the whole foundations of the government and everything is of this world, i.e. of Satan. And it has to be abolished, and all of our elites. I mean, fast forward to 2016 and the supernaturalization of the enemy, is complete. They're Hillary's literally a baby eating Satanist now. You know what I mean? It's it's never going back in the jar, So yes,
literally the Antichrist.
Yeah,
they had the History Channel movie or something where they had an actor who kind of vaguely looks like Obama playing the Antichrist. Yeah.
On the History Channel. Good job, guys. Yeah. So I think the effect of it was, turn everybody's faith in the whole system of government against it, so that, it just makes the job easier. You lower the fulcrum, so you can raise the fulcrum so you can get a good leverage on there. And it's the more you erode the ground out from under everybody, the easier the task is when it's time to actually do the judo flip,
Absolutely. Now, for me, I think the most fascinating aspect of this 4G warfare thing is its ties to conspiracy culture, which we've been kind of alluding to throughout this. Now, I've written a lot on my blog and even a bit in Strange Tales of the Parapolitical about the origins of modern conspiracy culture, and that's very much in the American Security Council. The ASC really seems to have been behind much of the dissemination of the anti-UN, the anti-Rockefeller, the anti-Fed, the anti-IRS type conspiracy
Yeah.
tropes, which have all been raised and weaned on for years and years now. And it did this through outfits like the John Birch Society, the Liberty Lobby, and so forth, which there was a lot of overlap in membership with the ASC.
Mm.
Now, the ASC was effectively the far right's answer to the Council on Foreign Relations during a lot of the Cold War until it was superseded by the CMP in the 1980s. But it was also essentially a vast private intelligence network as well. It was deeply involved in blacklisting and a host of other just outrages. But as such, modern conspiracy culture really should be seen through the prism of psychological warfare. And indeed, Colonel Michael Aquino, one of the great Psy-War officers of the 20th century, was a member of the American Security Council at one point, though he has apparently tried to deny it ever since. But does this go even further than that? Keith, I mean, you seem to have been suggesting throughout all this that modern conspiracy culture has been very much weaponized in an aspect of full G warfare, full blown, correct?
Yeah, that's kind of the conclusion I've come to. And like I said, looking at these articles the last month and just kind of digging into them when I've had time, it's like it kind of, when you have this model, to this paradigm to look at all these other things that maybe don't seem as connected, and you're like, oh my God, it's all part of the same. You got your moral, you got your intellectual, you got your physical combat, you got the whole, basket. But Bonner Fellers, he's on the letterhead of the old ASC stuff. I mean, that guy ran the psychological warfare department in an official capacity for MacArthur's Pacific Empire during and after World War II. I mean, so Psy-War is like baked into the cake with the ASC,
He was also a John Bircher too, Keith. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but he was also a John Bircher as well.
I've seen some of his private letters, and boy, he hated him some Jews, man. Tell you what. Anyway, I think. Okay, I'll just drop a bomb, and maybe you can decide if it deserves some unpacking, and then I can try to back it up. And that is that the conspiracy culture, the conspiratainment info complex, is itself an organ of the very deep state that they haven't shut up about for the last 3 years. It's deep state.
Yes.
Yeah,
and what I mean by that, Mike Lofgren, he wrote that kind of famous essay in 2014 where he's talking about this deep state. And his definition, I think, is a misnomer, but it passes the smell test. He was talking about not so much a smoke-filled room affair, although there's no doubt some of that, but he was talking about this vast behemoth, or I guess I should say Leviathan, of the federal bureaucracy and the degree to which it's held captive by big business, Silicon Valley, the defense industry, the lobbyists. I mean, K Street is a real place you can go to. It's not like a secret, and it's kind of feeds into that sentiment that people have that it's all the same and it never changes no matter who's in the Oval Office, which was true, to a large extent. And this guy said, that's this deep state. You can't really make reforms. This stuff is too entrenched, and the special interests are too impacted into the whole thing. Again, I don't see how anybody could really argue with that. But when I think of deep state, I think of it in terms of the old tradition of parapolitics, which I would set up as the good twin of the conspiracy theory genre, right? And we can maybe get into the differences later if you guys want, but as I see it. But this would be going back to like Carl Schmitt, Hitler's jurist, kind of argued for, well, there's you got your state, you got your democratic powers, you got your elections and things, and then you have states of emergency where all of that has to be suspended because there's something bigger than that going on. And who makes that determination? That's the deep state, or he called it the mock state. And that's the sovereign power is the power of he or they who can switch on and off the state of emergency that suspends all that regular stuff. That goes all the way back to Nazi Germany, and it's like a theory, and a practice. Okay. But Hans Morgenthau, I think he worked for the State Department in the 50s. He started talking about this dual state. You've got your regular politics, and then you've got these forces that depend on and they're legitimized by regular politics, but they also have veto power over those regular politics. And so if you want to look at Gladio, this is your best example you could come up with. Like, are the Italian communists going to take 30% of the seats this election? Hell no, they're not. We're going to get these Red Brigade, these nice young men who think they're, dying for the cause, and we're going to have them bomb a bank or a train, and they're going to get blamed on it in the press, and people are going to lose faith in them and not pull the lever for them. And presto, they took 5 seats instead of 30 or whatever. That's veto power over democracy by use of terrorism, the press, psychological warfare, whatever. The big one for the U.S., John F. Kennedy, right? We are staying in Vietnam,
Yep.
Mr. Kennedy. We're not going to sign this treaty disarming all nuclear weapons and having a UN police force that's going to see to it that everybody lays their weapons down and hammer swords into plowshares. You're going to be picking your brains up off the pavement before that shit happens, right? That's deep state to me, okay? So has the conspiracy industry, can you look at it and see how it might fit into that model? I mean, I think you can. It's like it's kind of a something that chips away and undermines democracy. They're all the same. They're all baby eating Satanists.
Can I?
Go for
Yes.
it.
Can I go into a little bit? I agree with you in that, and it's okay. So I believe that the modern conspiracy movement, whatever you want to call it, a lot of it had started itself within the right side of the world order. Whether you have many of the authors who wrote a lot of what we call conspiracy literature or had a voice in the conspiracy movement, whether it's John Stormer, one of the author of None Dare Call It Treason, Gary Allen, Larry Abraham of authors of None Dare Call It a Conspiracy. They were John Birch Society members. G. Edward Griffin was a John Birch.
The capitalist conspiracy too. What's his name? Cleon.
Yeah, I was about to get him. The Naked Communist.
Okay, the Naked Communist. Yes, you're right.
Mm-hmm. Him being a John Birch Society member, and him eventually being a founding member of the Council for National Policy, and then his nephews, Mark Skousen and Joel Skousen, later being a big part of modern conspiracy culture, and CMP members too as well. So you have them. You have Eustace Mullins, who would later be a whistleblower for the John Birch Society, possibly, but him of himself was also a John Birch Society member. Then you have Alex Jones, and then if you want to talk about like conservative voices that have been in the CMP, like Mark Levin or Rush Limbaugh speaking to the CMP twice, or so you have a lot of Sean Hannity speaking, to the CMP. So you have like that, your standard fourth estate, faux news, type people pushing it, but you also have your conspiracy culture pushing it too as well. Many of these CMPers, Paul Craig Roberts is another Council for National Policy member who's big in the truth movement. So you have them making around. John Birch Society and national policy type tactics. Heck, Alex Jones had a Jesuit JBS member, John F. McManus, on their show multiple times. So they are the truth movement. And now to go a step further, I believe, like Josh Reeves talked about in Spellcasters, that our truth movement has a lot of this element of the right wing of the world order. Much of what we talked about today, causing a whole bunch of fourth generational warfare to achieve their objectives, but also Scientology. Scientology's got a big part of the truth movement. A lot of our modern truth movement beliefs, like John F. Kennedy, for example. John F. Kennedy, the martyr, he's fighting against the deep state. No, it's farthest from the truth. And when you really get down into the dirties, John F. Kennedy wasn't gonna tear the CIA into a thousand pieces. He loved Allen Dulles and the Dulles family. The whole rivalry between them was faked. Kennedy
Huh.
was a deep state president, true and true. They made him look like he was a martyr, something that we could all rally against and spend years upon years upon years upon years trying to figure out his assassination. I mean, you can look at
Right. Busy work.
The Hunt's involvement in his assassination, for example, which no one on the right talks about. The wanted for treason posters, the John Birch Society's involvement. I mean, it came out recently in the JFK files that who was the Tippit, Officer J.D. Tippit, was the head of the John Birch Society in Dallas.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, the John Birch Society had a major play in the Kennedy assassination, but that's not talked about on the right. So again, that became
They'd rather go with the Oswald was a commie.
yes,
Or Oswald the commie was it was the Russians. Can we go to war now?
exactly. That was the rallying cry for the modern day conspiracy culture, just like for us millennials was 9/11. And so it became that control nexus standpoint for us to be talking about and debating it and
Right.
being
It gives birth
prepared to
to
be
this.
co-opted, for years.
It makes this whole industry of how many building sevens can fit on the head of a grassy knoll, and the new book is out, and this physics, this couldn't have happened the way they say it. It's like busy work. It's just like, here, you study every book that ever comes out about this and debate about it and wring your hands about it for the next 30 years while we move on and do something else. Yeah, it's the whole industry of just trying to like figure it out. I think it wasn't the commies. I'll just put it that way. Yeah.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, no, and then of course, I mean, it's just really ironic, amusing, whatever you want to call it, that the conspiratorial right really does hold Kennedy up as a martyr because as Keith had alluded to, I mean, he really does seem to have been serious about the UN peacekeeping forces. He essentially had been pursuing a back channel, I believe, with Avril Harriman, if I remember correctly, with the Soviets, essentially trying to reduce the U.S.'s level of nuclear weapons. We actually had a significant advantage over the Russians during the early 60s, which had led a lot of our generals to think that it would be a wonderful ideal to just go ahead and stage a preemptive attack on the Soviet Union at the time, because we'd only lose about 7 or 10 million Americans or something in the conflict that would follow. But Kennedy definitely, I mean, he really was very pro-liberal internationalism, pro-UN, just everything that the conspiratorial right utterly despises. So it is a bit of an irony, to put it mildly, that he is held up as such a martyr to them in this day and age. But okay, so let's get into some of the modern instances of this 4G warfare and the weaponization of conspiracy culture by it. Okay, so let's start with the Pizzagate thing and the flap over Anthony Weiner leading up to the 2016 election. When you look away from the conspiracy itself and who was spreading these allegations, you start seeing people like Eric Prince. Certainly this, I think, was a significant revelation coming in October, right before the election. Keith, did you see this as an instance of 4G warfare?
Yeah, so we're going from Keith, you want to talk about Franklin, to Keith, you want to talk about Pizzagate. Ugh.
That's just how we roll, man.
Apparently so, man. A few weeks ago, I think you were on Jason Horsley's Liminalist podcast. I'm a big fan of his, just like I'm a big fan of yours. And so I caught that interview, and at some point during that time, you were talking about the value of what I would call meta conspiracy analysis, like not the thing itself. Hold one hand over your eye, and have the other one wide shut, and look at who's pushing what do they hope to gain from it. What's the point? Set aside the truth or the factual basis of it, and just be like, what's the play here? What do you want? Why are you trying to get me to look into this? Kind of thing. So, there's an excellent guy out there on the internet. I think he's in Croatia. His name's Branko Malik. He runs a website called Cali Tribune, and it's really great. His voice and his cadence and the things that he says are just great. And he's a conservative Catholic, Christian, and kind of on the traditionalist side. And I like to listen to him. And he put something out where he talked about Pizzagate, and I think it was something like the problem with the study of evil, or something like that. And he really prescribed prayer to Jesus in particular, when it comes to going into this chapel perilous of looking into things that are just the darkest shit you can ever imagine people getting up to. And, just have the protection of the Holy Father when you go into these dark places. And I think it's good advice. I alluded to this before. There's kind of like a self-traumatizing thing that you're doing to yourself. You're kind of initiating yourself into somebody's story or this, mythological thing. And then, again, set aside if it's real or not. Just your experience as a consumer of this, and you decide, I'm going to go look at Elephantis's Instagram now, and I'm going to really see if I can figure all this out for myself. And you can hurt yourself doing that, and I think it goes into this dynamic that is it's hard to articulate, but I'll try. Okay. There's a book called A Most Accursed Religion, When Trauma Becomes a God. Is written by a therapist, after decades of having traumatized people on his couch, and some of his conclusions that he come to. And basically traumatic events, I'm going to do a really bad rendition of it right now, but just hear me out. Big traumatic events, whether it's a car crash or a near-death experience, or, your time as an altar boy, whatever it is, right? They're too big to fit into your consciousness. And so the way that you try to metabolize that and make the unconscious conscious is through resort to the divine, to mythological, or, kind of ways to rationalize it and say how it happens, like a big tornado or a hurricane. They call it an act of God for a reason, the Bible says that it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. And I think it's true. And in the Bible, God traumatizes, and the best you can ask for is deliverance from his wrath. He's also the source of mercy from his own wrath. And it's just this odd, kind of equation. And that's what you get with monotheism. There's no division of labor, right? But there's a supernatural aspect to trauma. Okay. So, and there's a traumatizing effect from the supernatural. God traumatizes, trauma divinizes. Okay. So back to what I was trying to say. When you have made the enemy now from godless communist hordes to literal baby-eating Satanists in robes and Maria Abramovich and all this kind of stuff, you're tapping into a religious response in people. You're going for it. You're casting your adversary as a supernatural villain, okay? And so I think almost like if you do a lot of drugs or something, you open these neural pathways, and they're only going to grow back so far. And there maybe is some analog of that when it comes to trauma. You have these kind of trauma centers in your psyche that respond to supernatural narratives and things like that. So as it concerns Pizzagate, again, whether or not any of it's true, it has that supernatural pull to it, and it really goes right to your reptile brain. And I think that everything I just said is pretty far out on a limb, but I will tell you something. I read this morning, and this is why I'm bringing this up. Somebody from the QAnon cult, I don't know how else to put it, got arrested in New York yesterday. She's going after the USS Comfort. She's live streaming it on Facebook. And she's trying to bring, the storm. The storm is upon us, and it's like this millennial event where when all of the creeps and perverts get locked up, everything's going to be okay, And so I'll read you a quote because I wrote it down. First, she's saying, I'm here because we got to take down Podesta and Clinton and their little henchman, Joe Biden. And she says, and I quote, "In the name of Babylon," which I don't know if that's some Freudian slip, but I would have thought in the name of Christ would have been better, but Babylon, okay. And then she says, and I'm quoting, "I can't be set free without them gone. Wake me up."
That's chilling.
So to me, that is I'm just going to speculate and be armchair shrink for a second. That is a lady that's had, like almost everybody you ever meet, something bad happened to this person. And she has now externalized and made this vicarious thing where if only we could take down these people, I'm going to be healed. And so when I'm sitting here thinking this whole thing about trauma, and a lot of this, that book, God of Trauma, that was a Jason Horsley recommendation I saw on his website, and I'm really glad I read it. It really explains a lot about how mythology works and the psyche and everything. So anyway, is Pizzagate just completely designed or just like the perfect pushing of that button? Oh yeah. Is this lady that got arrested in New York yesterday the first one to, remember the guy going into the Comet Pizza looking for the basement that doesn't exist? I don't know, man. Yeah, so did it have those 4G effects? I think the answer's got to be yes, and also salted the earth behind the victory in 2016, and the QAnon phenomenon would not have happened without Pizzagate, and a cigar will never be a cigar ever again. And when your reptile brain has become activated by this supernaturalized response, okay, Pizzagate's like the capstone on the pyramid, and the people that are in it, there's a lot of them that are never coming back out. And that just is sad, The main thing though about it is you can observe the timing of it right before the election. The effect, demoralizing the Democratic base already more than they were. They stay home because they're looking at an Elefantis Instagram page instead of going out and voting, going, could it be? Could it be? So yeah, we're in a post Pizzagate world. That's how I feel about it. Thanks for asking me to talk about that one. Jeez.
Yeah, it's definitely a chilling prospect, that's for sure. Okay, I wanted to cover 3 topics that John and I had gotten into a little bit last week. Now, first up, John pointed out the CNP hand behind some of these alleged grassroots protests against the lockdown, which Trump has taken to endorsing on Twitter, so long as it's in a Democratic-controlled state. John, could you go back over that for just a moment for us, please?
Yes, of course. So I started doing research into these nationwide protests because they seemed very reminiscent to the Tea Party movement, which, there are many patriots, just like you have with these protests that you would see involved in the Tea Party movement, very well-meaning Americans, that are doing what they believe is right for their country, and the same could be said for those who participate in Occupy Wall Street movement, who, of course, I'm more right-leaning in my political beliefs, but I can't say that those people didn't want what they thought was best for the country either. So the Tea Party movement, whether it was started as a controlled movement by the Council for National Policy, or was later co-opted, and we'll get to the same players being involved in both movements now with the Operation Gridlock and the planned protests for the coronavirus pandemic, where I believe that there's a lot of astroturfing going on. You can debate that. So with the groups, there was a lot of funding that was seen. So the pages that were put up for Operation Gridlock, where they had like Operation Michigan, Operation Virginia, they all tied in down to Florida by one single domain register using GoDaddy. So it wasn't like these individual states through John and his state of North Carolina, putting up his own webpage about protesting the lockdown in North Carolina, or or you guys in your states doing the same. This was all coming from one central register with connections to the DeVos family. So a lot of these quote unquote grassroots movements were funded by the CMP DeVosses, the CMP Zionist Mercers, and the Council for National Policy Kochs, the Koch Institute. So they were, funding all of these movements. Operation Gridlock, in my opinion, was horrible optics. We got, a lot of conservatives got mad when Occupy Wall Street was blocking bridges in New York City, or when during Trump's election in 2016, liberal activists were blocking Arizona freeway, for example, not allowing ambulances to go by or emergency services to go by, and we were all holding our noses up on them and saying how dare they do such a thing. But then we're protesting an Operation Gridlock by quote unquote social distancing and protesting in our cars and blocking roads and emergency vehicles, and we're not to think that that's not going to have bad optics or whatever. So with the May Day protests, which May Day is easily associated with world communism or even Beltane. You have the major protests being run by American Revolution 2.0, but from what I could see, they seem to be pretty grassroots from what I could see, however, but they have been co-opted by Open the States. Open the States is run by Conventions of States Action, which is run by Mark Meckler and Eric O'Keefe. Now, Eric O'Keefe is a board member of Wisconsin Club for Growth. He's a major pillar of the Koch Institute, the Koch brothers and everything. So he's definitely hugely in bed with the Kochs, or Eric O'Keefe is. And Mark Meckler, he was a co-founder of the Tea Party Patriots movement with Council for National Policy member, who is on the executive committee of the CMP, Jenny Beth Martin. So yeah, whatever grassroots these May Day protests were supposed to be, yeah, they were definitely co-opted by major interests, and they are astroturfed. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't well-meaning patriots and people who believe and, exercising their right of freedom of assembly and being able to protest. I'm not saying that at all. However, I'm saying that these movements and these protests are organized and funded by these powerful Council for National Policy interests, and in doing so, you're going to end up getting astroturfing. You're going to end up getting pre-printed signs and multiple signs. It's pretty much to make instead of what I think these people should be doing, which is like local organization and doing nonviolent protests for good optics, wearing your mask, social distancing at these protests, so that when the police crack down, and they will crack down even on protesters who are following all the rules, that makes them look like the aggressors, not us toting our guns up there, not wearing masks or not following social distancing, breaking down the Wisconsin legislature or the Michigan legislature building. That's not most of America is middle left, more than likely. They go like their Starbucks and watch their late night shows at night and everything, and then so when they see the Fourth Estate putting clips of these patriots who just want to go back to work, they just want their country back, they don't want to be put under the boot of the world order during the coronavirus pandemic, it makes them look bad. Just like on the left, you have all of these globalists, you have all these videos of these nurses. A lot of them do appear to be staged. A lot of them could just be the nurses blowing off steam or whatever during the pandemic, but a lot of these TikTok videos are very poor taste. It's really upsetting a lot of people. So you have it on both sides. They're pushing the polarity of the right-left paradigm to this. I didn't think the chasm could get any worse, but it definitely is now. And then when you look into the Convention of the States, for example, the Koch funded part behind all these May Day protests. They want to have a constitutional convention, which is, again, it's just for further balkanization and destabilization of the United States. If we ever did a constitutional convention, it'd be under their rules. And, they would, whatever constitution they came up would definitely not be for us. And the Kochs and George Soros came together to fund this con movement in the late 2000s. Both the left and the right came together to screw us and try to push this through. So these people do not have our best interests in heart. And also Russia got caught as well, funding the protests too. There was one protest in Texas that Russia put up both the for and against. You had both the right and the left on opposite sides protesting. It was Russia who was the provocateur. So, right. I'm pretty sure someone. Yeah, polarization is the point. I'm pretty sure that you'll if you really look deep, you'd see Russia being involved with these protests too as well, to further destabilize and hopefully end up with balkanization and secession of different states within the United States to weaken us. It's really a mess. It really is a mess.
Absolutely. Now, another thing that really, we got into yesterday and really kind of jumps out, the globalists trolling the far right over COVID. You've got Bill Gates taking on the mantle of the Antichrist, the spirit cooking chick with a Rothschild in front of a painting called Satan Summons His Legions, the One World broadcast, and so on. I mean, this is some pretty hardcore trolling, and I don't think we've really seen anything like this since 1991 or so. In 1991, you had the quasi-UN army in Babylon, the rise of the EU, the fall of the Soviet Union, and Old Man Bush's NWO speech. And it continued on in later years with Ruby Ridge and Waco in 92 and 93, respectively. And it was all unfolding against this, this backdrop and a major change in the world order at the time. Now, Keith, I know you've kind of alluded to this being kind of a script change, so to speak. Do you think that that's kind of what we're seeing now with this, again, this heightened sense of trolling and what have you? Is this, signaling that we are getting into another transformative period?
Well, yeah. I mean, you can look back into the 90s, like I was saying, with Bill Clinton name checking, Carol Quigley and Bush name checking the New World Order and like this kayfabe, like, let me push some buttons here and get people polarized. And then you look, I caught about 30 minutes of that One World Together at Home thing. And it's like all of that turned up to like 11. I just couldn't believe it. I mean, I muted it when Lady Gaga's doing it. I don't need to hear it, but I want to hear what they're saying. What are they saying? So mute the music. Sorry, Billie Eilish, whatever. Your vocals were too low. Sorry. And then what is this lady? What is it? Amira, something with an A, Mohammed. And she's like the Deputy Secretary General of the UN. And she's got a turban on and she's addressing me on television. And I didn't know who this person is. And talking about how we're all in this together and it's one world, and there's a caption up in the top left of the screen that says Global Citizen, which that's the name for the big global nonprofit that put the thing on, but it also says Global Citizen, like you're a global citizen. And I was like ready to sign up for the John Birch Society, man. I'm like, oh my God, because like I said, I'm not down for any of this shit. I don't, of course I want other parts of the world to be supported and get vaccines and get treatments and all this stuff, but I don't need to hear from the Deputy Secretary of the UN, and it's this weird like infomercial. It wasn't a concert, everybody's at home, right? So it's like this big telethon infomercial for the UN and the World Health Organization. And again, it's like Clinton's speechwriter, like, can we take the Carol Quigley part out of this? It's really going to raise a lot of hackles. And instead they're like, no, we're going full bore with this. And I'm just thinking about what people on the right wing side of things looking at this and just like, all right, I'm going to clean my other AR now, stock up on some green beans. This shit's upon us, man, because that was the vibe. And I just couldn't believe it. It's like, do you people understand what kind of response you're going to generate by just trolling the way you're doing? It was bizarre. And I switched to Homestead Rescue and watched like 3 episodes, which I'd never heard of that show. and I was like, this is my scene right here, not not the world together at home UN infomercial. It was just a little creepy, man, to be honest.
Yeah, last week we had kind of speculated a little bit about the ratings for that. I finally had looked it up. It was 20 million viewers in the United States, which is somewhat respectable. But I mean, the Super Bowl that just happened a couple of months ago got 100 million, and they didn't have quite the captive audience that the One World broadcast had, so to speak. So, yeah, that's not the best showing. You kind of managed about the ratings maybe of an especially good NFL playoff game, and I honestly gotta wonder just how many people even tuning in briefly were just kind of guys like us, conspiracy researchers, parapolitical researchers, or whatever, just who wanted to gaze at this spectacle for a few minutes before we
that
went
was my
to,
angle. Yeah.
John, I think that's why you tuned in too, if I'm not mistaken, right? Oh man. But yeah.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Yes, it was Recluse. It definitely was. And man, I tell you what, it sure was something, I guess. I'll leave it at that. I mean, it, it was definitely to trigger all of the conspiratorial right into being like, what the heck is it?
Yeah. And then, of course, at the same time, you've got Bill Gates coming out with the vaccine and the tracking or whatever with it. And I mean, the more I look at this, I mean, the more absurd it seems. I mean, when we had the aftermath of 9/11, they pushed through the Patriot Act just a couple of weeks later. In this case, you probably could have passed through a law for a mandatory vaccine and some kind of tracking chip or something right at the height of the COVID panic in March, and instead they send Bill Gates out to do a TED Talk where he briefly mentions this scheme that might be implemented in over a year. And then, of course, they censor the section of the video out after it's already been up on YouTube or whatever, and numerous copies of it and what have you have been made. And yeah, you really, really have to wonder what the agenda was behind this by this Machiavellian scheme that nonetheless we're going to, give the opposition a good year to organize in, response to, and see how that goes. And like Keith said, maybe it's time to buy another AR while you're at it.
What the big standout for me on that was, if you really try to approach these subjects objectively and put yourself in the shoes of everybody, all the belligerents in the big 4GW war or whatever, and try to, suss out, do they have a legitimate gripe here or not, and we picked on the right wing side of things in this podcast, and they deserve it. They've really gotten a pass. But as far as the enemies that they're looking at and trying to fight against and whatever, going back 100 years, going back 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago to the stupid One World Lady Gaga Fest thing, that dog will hunt, man. They're not wrong. It's a thing, and it's just another reminder of that, and it's like, once again, I'll just restate, I'm not down for any of it. I don't like the alternatives. And for people that maybe are like me and kind of in the middle and like a pox on all their houses or whatever, it's like there's nowhere to go. It's so polarized, like John said, that it's like there's no middle anymore. The middle is just like this gaping abyss, and you haven't picked a side, then you don't exist. And it's like, where do I go? I don't have a home as far as all these politically charged memes and tropes that are just dividing the hell out of us. It's very disturbing. The whole thing is really disturbing. I'm a patriot. I love the United States. I like this country, warts and all. I love it, and I'm proud to be one. And I don't know how much, I don't know what's going to happen, man, but it feels pretty uncertain times. So.
Well, let's go briefly over into what John had and I had talked about last week that I had dubbed the Book of Revelations LARP. Certainly, we've been seeing a little bit of this with Bill Gates and some of these other tropes, but there's stuff that you just can't dismiss out of hand, such as Africa currently being ravaged by locusts and what have you. Keith, I mean, what's your take on all of this exactly?
It's like Old Testament 7 plagues of Egypt out there. The West Coast burns down every other year. The big floods take out all the livestock in the Midwest. Puerto Rico is leveled Gulf Coast, and the eastern seaboard is just pummeled by hurricanes that seem to get bigger every year. Now we've got a literal plague, got literal plagues of locusts.
Little pestilence as well.
Yeah, and it's like, holy crap, man, get your Bible out, I guess. I mean, I guess they're right, here it is. And it's really kind of this odd, like, universe, earth kind of joke, like, oh, you want to get biblical? Let's get biblical. And it feels pretty biblical out there right now. So, Moses, come get us out of here,
Yeah, we can only hope, I suppose. But before closing out, there's one more thing I want to discuss with you guys, and that's the difference between conspiracy theorists and parapolitical researchers. We're all very much in the latter camp. We value research and especially finding primary sources such as personal papers, declassified documents, and all that good stuff. But I was hoping you guys could talk a little bit about the differences. I know we've alluded to it a little bit throughout the podcast, but I think this is a really important point, and I'd really like to hammer it home here as we're wrapping up. So let's start with you, John. We've read the documents. What are your thoughts on this subject?
Well, I believe conspiracy theorists, most of them are what I call regurgitators, in that they just sit around and it's like the kind of conversation that you would have with your buddies. You wouldn't, what do you think about this, or what do you think about that, and I know I guess you could say conspiracy theorist is a weaponized term, but they're going to start discussing stuff about Tartaria, or Hollow Earth, or this is what it reminds me of in a lot of ways, where there's not a lot of substance. People just kind of parrot what they've heard over and over and over again. They don't go look for themselves. They don't go to try to do research, whether it's primary sources or even secondary at this point. They're not doing any of that, or they do. It's very rare. And then you have people like us, all speaking here, and some other people that I hold in esteemed respect, like George from cavdev.org, for example, or people that are parapolitical researchers or investigative journalists. You can use any both of those terms, or either one of them. We're actually trying to track down the old books of the people before us that did the research and try to read what they say, and then try to get newspaper articles and see what those reporters said, and try to track down primary papers that were written by the people that we discuss, and try to spend time researching and say, okay, well, is this what this person really said was true? Is this what about this person is this true, for the best of our ability? There's always going to be a certain amount of unknown conclusions that we may come to, which is speculation, or there might be some sort of disinformation even from primary sources that we may be unknown that we end up reporting. But I think that is the difference primarily between the two forms of researchers when it comes into the realm of conspiracy or parapolitics. And I would say that 80 to 90% of the modern researchers into conspiracy now fall into column A, and 20 to 10% fall into column B. And we've had some ones previously in the past that were good researchers, like Alex Constantine or Daniel Hopsicker, for example, and who were investigative journalists. Danny Casolaro with the Octopus, Nick Bryant, just to name a few. Gary Webb, yes, the Dark Alliance. Thank you, Recluse. So there were people that did their due diligence, that did their investigating, and just didn't parrot what they were told. But it's a major problem, especially in today's conspiracy culture, because most people don't do that. They just parrot what they've heard. And I'm not saying that I'm not guilty of doing that. We all are to some degree. It's just trying to do your best to not do that, and do your best to do your due diligence. And it's almost impossible to do 100% due diligence on everything. I mean, we only have so many hours within a day, but it's about doing that extra step to trying to do that. Try to get documents that were previously known or previously obtained, like me with the finders, getting, interviewing Henry Skip Clements and interviewing Bob Harold, and that's what we're supposed to be doing as researchers. If we're going to research, that's what we should be doing, instead of sitting around all day just talking about what we think is happening, or speculating, which, you have your stereotypical Hollywood conspiracy theorists. They either smoke copious amounts of pot, and just like, dude, this is what I think, man, or they're paranoid schizophrenics, and I'm not saying that some of us here probably don't suffer from a little bit of those things, in our past or in our present, but there's a big difference between actually trying to drill down to the the crux of the argument, or trying to, like I named my channel, We've Read the Documents. There's a difference between that and just sit around talking all day, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So,
or picking YouTubes over books every time.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's so much easy. It's just like you reach out for the little dopamine, engage all your senses on a video, and books are hard,
They are.
They take so long to read as compared to just watch this guy rant for 20 minutes and be like, hey, guess what I saw,
So Keith, before we get into your response to that, are you seeing the Chinese troops in the UN Peacekeeper banner yet?
No sign, boss.
All right, I just wanted to make sure we
quiet.
We
I
have
don't have to run and grab my gun yet, is what you're telling me. Okay, I'm glad. All right, got a few more minutes.
Chinese troops. Okay, so let me riff off of that, and I'll segue, because it goes to my answer to that question. Maybe we can talk about this in more detail sometime, but one of these right-wing rags from the early 60s, maybe 59, that I read, sounded the alarm that there was some kind of UN peacekeeping force training exercises that were going to be taking place, maybe in Georgia, somewhere on the eastern seaboard and towards the south. And in this newspaper, this newsletter, this was like the social media of the time, everybody passed around these newsletters. It's like, here it goes. This is it. This is the end game. Lock and load. The communists are going to use this seemingly innocuous training exercise to get a beachhead on the eastern seaboard. And here's a map that shows the United States roped off into these zones of control these were leaked from Moscow, and they've already got us figured out. And I'll tell you literally, some swarthy Africans, it said, are going to be in charge of the deep south. Let's push that racial terror button. And maybe some hook tribesmen from the Philippines or commissars, under control of Moscow and China, are going to be in charge of the western seaboard. And then you look in that same guy's actual private correspondence, and he's reaching out and with his network that he had, and he's setting up, asking people, recruiting people to set up zones of control throughout the United States, and setting up parallel government in waiting, so that when the fit hits the shan, we can take over and restore America. And this projection of we put into we make our enemies as the mouthpiece for speaking the agenda that we actually have, but we put it in terms of the enemies doing it. But really, it's what we're doing. If you look at conspiracy literature with that filter, you put that filter on there and look at all the projection, look in the 2016 debates, you're the puppet, it's like that's the soundbite version, but it gets bigger from there. There's so much of that. Anyway, the biggest difference between conspiracy literature and parapolitical writing is, in my opinion, the conspiracy thing should be seen more as a religious movement, or a type of religious writing, rather than anything else. It lines up with that, in my opinion, better then it lines up with other ways to categorize it. I read a book a few years ago called The Crescent and the Compass by Angel Millar, and he was talking about, and I'll never forget it, he characterized the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion as a modern day religious text, like a type of modern day Gnosticism, where instead of powers and principalities we war against, I think that's in Ephesians, but I could be wrong. John, maybe instead of these invisible, forces of the devil or whatever, it's this cabal of, rabbis or whatever, but it had the effects of a religious text on the people that read it and believed its message.
It is Ephesians, Keith. You're right. Ephesians 6:12, I think.
See, I knew you'd had it. But yeah, it's this it's like a modern day religious text. And the other thing, going back to the commie takeover thing from the 60s that I talked about, it's totally got that. I mean, that little scenario I just painted a minute ago has a perfect echo in, I think it was, what year was it? 2004, 3, something, 2005, the Jade Helm thing.
I think Jade Helm was actually, that was Obama era, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Well, there's been
definitely
multiple iterations of Jade Helm.
We do those every couple of years, but yeah.
But the newest one was the Conspiracy Culture was in 2014, 2015, maybe 2016. It was before Trump, but it was when they were really like, remember the dots on your mailbox, which turned out to be like when you would get your newspaper weekly, and that's the code that they have when they're going to round up everybody,
that went back to Bill Cooper, if I'm not mistaken, the early 90s.
It was, but they made it. They ran the same play again for Jade Helm, just like they did with Jay-Z Knight and the School of Enlightenment with Ramtha and the Double Oneness, the Nassara Gassara scam. They're running it now with modern day QAnon again. Same plays they run over and over again.
Well, what they all have in common is this kind of basic formula of, we have an event. It's like the millennium is coming. You have to prepare, and you're inevitably disappointed. And it's just right out of that old book, When Prophecy Fails, which was written about a UFO cult that was supposed to all get taken up to the mothership, and then they don't. And people ridicule them. Did your flying saucer come get you? Didn't think so. And I think it says in the Bible too, the early Christians are saying, you're going to be persecuted for my sake, right? And so the humiliation that people get exposed to from the prophecy not coming true makes them feel rejected by the rest of society. And some of them will move on, but other ones will cling closer. And this is how you separate the sheep from the goats. And so John just gave me like 3 or 4 examples of this kind of Jade Helmish, here come the blue helmets coming over the hill, everybody lock and load. It's the same playbook with the preacher that says the rapture's coming on May 5th, 2020. It's the same trope behind the UFO disclosure is imminent and the Pleiadian Tesla technology is going to make everything okay again. It's the same trope behind QAnon. The mass arrests are going to start, and then everybody's going to, Big Daddy's going to make it all okay. It's the same kind of thing. It's like this test of your faith and your loyalty. And that's something that's like baked into the conspiracy culture cake. So parapolitics is bland and bloodless by comparison. It doesn't paint a supernatural enemy. It doesn't try to engage your reptile brain and make you want to stock up on cans of green beans and whatever. It's history, sometimes it's ugly.
If anything, it actually kind of tries to demystify it, really. Sorry, didn't mean to interject that. But
No, that's exactly right. I mean, in getting ready for this, I started reading the Coors Connection again. And, unless you're really interested in it, it's boring as hell. It's like,
Hey, now, Keith, that was a very interesting book, and I loved it. Okay, how dare you talk about Russ? Also like old Nazis too as well. Now, come on now.
But it doesn't have the production values.
It's not Stephen King. Let's just say that.
I know it's not, but as someone who's very interested in The Secret, right, like me, of course, I was like, when I first got my hands on it, I was like, oh, how did you know back then,
I mean, it's a
Yeah,
classic to
I'm
guys
with
like us, but yeah, I can see what Keith's saying. It's a little hard for somebody who doesn't know this kind of world to dive into something like that.
I
yeah,
know.
it's
I'm just
it's not there's not an emotional. It's not asking you for an emotional response. It's not asking you to think the absolute worst, and it's not making the people they're exposing into these supernatural predators. It's just history, you know. That's the difference. And the old magazines like Lobster and Covert Action Quarterly, in the 80s, Peter Dale Scott, all those guys. I mean, they kind of really developed this whole literature of deep politics and parapolitics and deep state as the term used to be understood. And it was a lot of it was in response to the Reagan years. And there's another thing I'll say about it. I mean, we've talked about the conspiracy culture being like, wired to the gills with feds. That's also, I think, true of the parapolitical sometimes. The whole industry is just watered, bled, fed, by the feds in a lot of cases. And it's like, if you haven't gotten the Gary Webb Award yet, and you're still writing some of this stuff, it gives me pause. Like some people get to keep writing the stuff, and some people jump off a building, but it's still useful, and there's a lot more footnotes to it, and it's harder to get through, and there's actually a lot more nourishment there rather than just kind of the candy of like stupid YouTube videos that, So I think there ought to be a revival of that. I think, there's probably some people out there that'll hear this and go, well, I'm already doing this, and a lot of people are, but you don't have the production values and the backing and the platforms that this mainstream industry has acquired. Books are boring.
And that's, really one of the big things. I mean, it just seems like conspiracy culture is everywhere now. It's been completely massified. Is this an aspect of 4th G warfare, Keith? And, what do you think ultimately is the end game behind it?
Well, if you go back to that Lind article and that James Scaminacci stuff that was on academia, and hear how these guys have articulated, and the Course connection, they've articulated the strategy, and it's like to challenge the legitimacy of the state by non-state actors. And Grover Norquist, I think I'll just let him do the talking. The famous quote from the early Reagan Revolution was the goal is to get the federal government small enough to where you can drown it in a bathtub, right?
mean, Keith? You mean the guy who funded Al Qaeda through the Alt-Equal Bank and Major Council for National Policy? Remember Grover Norquist?
Yeah.
He's our guy, right?
Power needs an enemy. So if you don't have a devil, you got to make one, right? So yeah, that guy. And I think that's the end game of all this. And I read something. I started to read it by Chris Hedges the other day. And Chris Hedges, I mean, great. He's on RT, and that's cool. Whatever. The revenge for Voice of America. It's fine. That's fair. And he's just going into this screed about how the American empire is this failed, awful thing, and it's going to collapse. And it's like, you could probably pull up something from the Bush years, and it's like almost like cut and paste. Been writing the same Jeremiads against the American imperium, for decades. And I'm not saying he's wrong, and I'm not saying he's not being a little ham-fisted about some of the stuff, but you look at it and he's like, they're all the same. The whole thing's all the same. And there's a lot of Democrats that are like, they're all the same. I'm voting for Mickey Mouse. I'm voting for Trump. I'm writing in Bernie, whatever. And it's like, I'm looking at this Chris Hedges article with my new 4GW eyes and going, oh my God, you're part of the problem. And it's a bind because he's not wrong. They are all kind of the same. The political class, really weren't a lot of daylight between them on things like invading Iraq and Afghanistan. That's like a big thing, right? So, the argument makes itself. Of course, they're all the same. Why are we there? But then you read these articles and you hear people hating on the Democrats and hating on the institutions and everything. And I don't blame them. I'm not even trying to say that, but they too are participating in eroding our faith in our government and our institutions and ultimately in our democracy. And I'm sure the Chris Hedges of the world would balk at the idea that they're playing into this agenda that's didn't come from their camp, but they are. And it doesn't matter that that dog will hunt. They're still helping to dismantle this thing that, if you asked them point blank, they'd probably say, I'd rather preserve it, conserve it, like a conservative. But, it's like everybody is against it, is against the state now. And this current crisis, the more the government fails in its basic duties to care for its people and stop this thing, the more that too plays into the narrative. Yeah, that's the government. It's broken, I wish we could just start over. And then it's like, yeah, we got a plan for that. So that's my take on it.
Well, that was a fabulous insight, Keith, and certainly rather disturbing one in light of all the things that are going on right now. Well, I want to thank both of you very much for being on the farm today. This has just been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I think our listeners are really going to enjoy this a lot as well. Hopefully I can have both of you gentlemen back on here in a couple of weeks or so. Keith, definitely I want you to keep giving us reports on that border there with Mexico and Arizona, and just let us know the moment that you start seeing those Chinese troops and the UN peacekeepers and so forth starting.
It's blue helmets. It's blue helmets, and they've all got the sniffles. Run.
Yes. John and I will get our guns, and we will be there too, split to help you out and fight back the invading hordes. All right, man?
And I'll tell you this, if the blue helmets ever really do come over the ridge, I'll be shoulder to shoulder with you men, and we'll fight them off together.
Absolutely. All right. Well, this has been great, guys. Thanks again so much. And like I said, I hope all of you listeners out there have enjoyed this. You guys are really hearing some first-class research here, and I hope everybody is taking notes. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now. Good night, good evening, and good luck in these troubled times to all of you.
Thanks for tuning in again, everybody. We'll have another exciting episode of The Farm next week.